Hello, everyone. Welcome back to History 11, and this is going to be an overview of Mercantilism, the Quest for Wealth. This is a lecture that will help us to sort of frame why Europeans, to a large extent, sought to trade with groups outside of Europe and what could have been the sort of economic necessity or the economic impetus that allowed them to do so. So we're here to just give an overview of this sort of uh, concept, economic concept of mercantilism, and this will be buttressed against the economic concept of capitalism that exists today. So let's get right into it. We can literally say that from the 16th through the 18th centuries, most kingdoms in Europe were heavily influenced by mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is not a unified, nor was it then, a unified theory of economics, unlike capitalism today, which is a unified theory. We know so much more about capitalism, how it works. Karl Marx was one of the real sort of early theorists who sort of encapsulated what capitalism is or was not. And later, of course, we had many more writers who would sort of pile on to what Marx did. So we know capitalism. You could take sort of capitalist theory here in the United States and go all the way on the other side of the world and apply those same principles. And capitalism would, by and large, look fairly the same everywhere. But this wasn't necessarily the case in Europe, where mercantilism was practiced a little bit differently from country to country, and of course it would have a wider range of results within Europe. But I'm just not going to detail so much of those different results because, of course, there was French mercantilism versus English mercantilism. But but we're here to just sort of give you the overview and the background to that. Now, the implications are is that governments should manage the economy. Now, this is a little bit different from capitalism, which says that the sort of overall attitude is a laissez-faire with government hands off, that free markets are better than governments having a hand. Mercantilism suggested just the opposite. And part of doing so, why government should be involved in the economy, is one, is to provide full employment and to try to guard against sloth amongst its citizenry. And this, the thought process would go towards building some type of national wealth and state power. So the overall concept here is that governments had a direct sort of um, line, or there was some direct idea that if they could control the economics happening within their boundaries and borders, that they and somehow would reap the mass benefit to that. Now, within free markets or in capitalist societies, the only way that governments can actually benefit from a free market system is through taxation, right? And that's where you have a lot of people who make the argument that government should not tax at all, that it should be complete and absolute money should go back to those people in the marketplace. And then you run into just basic questions about what about how do you fund armies, how do you build roads, right, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are somewhat of the implications, right, for that. So, but here the implication is that governments are deeply involved in running their economies. Now, the meanings of mercantilism go back, and we can extrapolate the definitions from the Latin, where we have two words, mercari, which means to run a trade, and merx, which means a commodity. Karl Marx defined a commodity essentially as anything that has value that could be put into the marketplace and to be exchanged or just literally bought and sold. If there's something that has no value, it's not a commodity. So commodities are things that have some value that can be exchanged for other things that eventually are part of some type of a trade, and therefore that's where you get the idea of mercantilism. And so commodities, you can think of them as just anything, right? So you have gold, silver, Orange juice is a commodity, bananas are a commodity, wheat's a commodity, bacon, pork bellies is a commodity, even air can be a commodity. People buy and sell air rights all the time, right? So again, anything that has any value is a commodity. We even get to the point now where things that you can't even actually hold are commodities. Like, for example, intelligence, right, could be a commodity. And so from this, what its definite implications for this is that how people thought of mercantilism is in these following ideas: that the wealth of a kingdom could be measured by the amount of precious metal, gold and silver, that it possessed, right? So kingdoms thought of themselves as wealthy by simply going to their treasuries and counting up all the silver and bullion and copper and all that stuff that you had in your treasury. That was the way that people measured their wealth. Today, we don't quite do that, right? We can measure wealth in so many other ways. Intelligence is a measurement of wealth, right? How many people within a nation have college degrees? You can say that a nation is, right, wealthy in terms of its intelligence, right? But this focus in on precious metals, gold, silver, copper, right, is called bullionism, right? So the idea, this is going to be important, is because the idea here is that, right, nations that had a lot of this stuff in their treasuries were deemed to be really wealthy, and nations that didn't have this stuff were deemed to be poor. So, for example, let's say that you were a nation that had a lot of oil underneath the ground and you didn't know about it, but the next door nation had a lot of silver in its vault, right? You would say that Welsh nation with the oil is poor because they don't have bullion within their treasury. Today, we'd look at that and we'd say any nation that's got oil reserves or gas reserves, like Russia, Nigeria, has some amount of wealth. The other concept here is and it goes along with this idea of bullionism, is that this was known to be a zero-sum game. In other words, if you had bullion, and let's say that you wanted your kingdom to buy fish for your citizens, and you bought fish from another country, and you paid for it in gold, then that means that you would have less gold within your treasury, and so then you would become less rich. Although your citizens would be fed, you would be considered to be much, much poorer. So the game then here becomes is that how do you have stuff without having to buy stuff from your enemies or other nations? And that's going to tie in. Today, in a capitalist society, we view trade as being good, right? Right? If we're selling a lot of stuff to people and we're buying a lot of stuff, right, we want to do trade balance, right? We want to bring stuff in that we don't have, and we want to sell stuff to other people, right? So we kind of play these trade games with ourselves and other nations, right? And so back then, trade with other groups would not necessarily seem to be a good thing to do. So you might want to ask yourself at this particular point, if that's true, then how are people getting stuff that they don't have? And that would be a really good question to ask. And we'll try to cover that in just a second. So one of the things that you must do is export more than you import. And part of the thing that you're going to do is encourage manufacturing. And of course, you're going to encourage agricultural production. The manufacturing is going to allow you to be able to have the things that you don't have or get the things that you don't have. And the agricultural production is to feed your population so you're not buying things from other nations. So here, the goal is trying to minimize mass consumption by the classes, particularly the lower classes. So you want to be able to regulate how wealthy these groups are and what they're doing with their money. You don't want your vast sums of gold to leave your nation, because then if it does, how do you get it back? It's not like you can just go dig a hole and there's a gold reserve there, right? These are things that people would be conscious and thinking about. But then the problem would be then is that if it takes gold to buy things, how do you buy things, right? So then you would have to create alternative economies like bartering. You have 3 shoes, right? I have 2 shirts, and I will exchange, right, the shirts and shoes now. That limits what you can really do, because then you have to go around and you have to find a need, right, for someone who needs the things that you have. So the bartering economy is greatly not as advantageous as, let's say, a bullion styled economy would be. But nevertheless, that's what we had at the time period. You also want to focus on conquest and the acquisition of colonies, because let's say that you don't have a lot of, let's say, lumber in your nation, and you conquest an area of territory across the Atlantic Ocean that has a lot of lumber, then now you have your own lumber reserves. So from this standpoint, now you can see why trade was important to people, because if you could go and grab colonies and not just merely trade with people, then that would essentially help you to become wealthy. And so, in order to be able to get these colonies, then you needed to have things like a national defense, right? And you needed to organize this national defense and these militaries and the Navy and et cetera. So you became much, much more efficient, right, in doing so. So part of what mercantilism is going to be doing for these European countries is quickly helping to modernize them, and particularly in terms of its military. Right now, there are actually criticisms of mercantilism, and probably right now you've probably already seen a couple of them. And one is the emphasis on production, right, and less on consumption. And today in Western societies and capitalist oriented societies, consumption is everything. If some of you are literally, I think you might be old enough to have been during the Iraq War with 9/11. One of the things that George Bush did when the the attack on the United States is that he told people to get back out and go shopping, because people were huddled up in their houses, they weren't flying, and so George Bush had to coax people out of their homes and said, get back out and go buy some stuff, right? Because capitalist economies only work when people shop, right? And I'm quite sure you've heard of the idea of shop till you drop, right? And so this concept in mercantilism, where people were producing things but nobody was buying anything or didn't have the opportunity to buy stuff, is certainly not going to work, because then why produce shoes if nobody can buy them? The other one is protectionism, right? So if governments are deeply involved in the economy, and let's say that you have a industry, let's say shoes, that are making really bad shoes, and nobody really wants those shoes, right? So in capitalism, if nobody wants your products, you're probably going to go out of business. But in mercantilism, the governments protected those industries and made sure that they didn't go out of business. And people would argue in capitalism that it's not the way to go, right? That you ought to allow companies to prosper and to go out of business, that kind of thing, or right. And so then that's the way a free market works, right? So what we get out of this is the creation of black markets, because if nobody wants your shoes, they're just going to go and find people that obviously have shoes for sale, and probably these people are working in the black market, and you may be even importing shoes from other countries that are better quality, right, and that sort of thing. So the French during their mercantilist period would actually go and inspect different industries, and they literally would arrest people for producing poor quality made items, and even threaten them with execution if they didn't produce good goods, right, or decent goods. So black markets. The other area here that was, of course, important was the idea of bullion was not necessary for economic success. And what we kind of mean by that is, of course, people are going to be wanting to trade for gold and silver, but you have to find gold and silver in order to be able to trade with it. So could you figure out another alternative means to money that would allow people who didn't necessarily have gold and silver to trade? And this is going to be one of the great arguments within economic history, is what happens when there's not enough gold and silver to go around to everybody? And the United States would eventually go off the gold standard by the 1970s, when we just basically looked around the world and we noticed that the Soviet Union and South Africa were producing large amounts of gold, and we didn't want to be beholden to these countries, so we just went off the gold standard. Now, what people are trading is just basically paper money backed by the good faith and credit of the United States. And now people are doing things like trading cryptocurrency, right? So I do that. I have some cryptocurrency that I have. So I'm even looking at that and saying, you know what, gold, silver, and even paper money, what do we need that when we can trade, right, digits, right, on over the internet, right? So this idea that bullion wasn't necessary, credit could be another way for people to do business, right? And then what we have is a book that was written by Adam Smith in 1776 called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations. Now, one of the things about Adam Smith's books is that this was really the first real definitive layout of the capitalist economic system. And what Adam Smith really is arguing in this is that nations could, and people essentially could, become wealthy if they followed certain capitalistic guidelines. And one of them, of course, would be the division of labor, the idea of the pursuit of self-interest, of course, freedom of trade, which would be probably one of the biggest ones, freedom of trade. And so what we'll get out of this is freedom of the seas, right? The ability to trade goods across the ocean without being attacked by pirates or other nations, right? And so this is something that we're still dealing with today. So with capitalism, we have this unified and codified economic system where the means of production are mostly held in private hands for profit, right? Where in mercantilism, although you have private individuals obviously working and doing business, they're mostly, the government has a heavy influence to play in mercantilist economic enterprise. So to conclude here, we can see that nations must consider a favorable balance of trade. National defense would be increased. Colonization is imperative, hence the 13 colonies. And of course, mercantilism was criticized and showed its limitations, and that capitalism later with Adam Smith's writings and other individuals' writings would be seen as a key to economic prosperity. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to message me.